The river took her before she even had breath to scream, the current slamming her small body against stones, water tearing into her chest until her lungs burned like fire inside her ribs, her hands clawing at nothing but foam as she spun beneath the roar. Miriam was 10, too light for the flood, too heavy with fear, and she thought she was already dead when arms like iron wrapped around her waist and yanked her up through the black churn. She burst into air with a cough that split her throat raw, the world spinning, rain stinging her face as her rescuer's voice cut through the thunder. A low grunt, fierce, steady, a language she didn't understand but carried the strength of command. He was no older than 15, lean and quick, his dark hair plastered to his brow, eyes sharp as flint as he dragged her toward the bank. Twice the water tried to claim them both, sucking their legs under, battering them against roots. But he never let go, his grip unbreakable even as blood ran from a gash on his temple where the current had struck him. Miriam gasped and thrashed, choking on terror, but he held her against his chest and drove forward until the mud rose under them, and he threw her onto the bank with a force that slammed the breath back into her lungs. She lay on her side, hacking up river water, vision blurred, her heart galloping like a colt gone wild, and through the haze she saw him, tall for his years, chest heaving, his body shaking but his eyes never leaving her. For a breath, they just stared at each other, child and boy, her lips trembling as if she could say thank you, but no words found her, only a soundless sob. He stepped closer, pressed one palm to her chest as though to feel her heart still beating, and then nodded once, sharp, like a vow had been sealed between them. Shouts rose in the distance, her father's voice, men calling her name, and the boy stiffened, his head jerking toward the trees. He didn't linger. Without a word he turned and sprinted into the timber, vanishing into the storm, his footprints washed away by rain before her father reached her side. Miriam clung to her father's coat with shaking hands, crying she had been saved. But when they asked who had pulled her from the river, she could only whisper, "A warrior." And though the flood would pass, though years would carve her into a woman, and grief would harden her into steel, that image, the boy's eyes burning through the storm, the hand pressed to her chest as if claiming her life, never left her. 30 years later the river still haunted her dreams, the roar in her ears waking her in the black hours of night. And Miriam, now 40 and lined with grief, would rise from her bed and stand at the window of the cabin her husband had built before death took him, staring at the empty prairie with her daughter asleep in the next room. Widowhood had carved her shoulders heavy. The farm demanded more than her hands could give, and the last season had left her stores thin, her fences half broken, her stock stolen by raiders who laughed at law. Fear had been creeping closer every day, whispers of a gang that rode the valley, taking what they pleased, burning what they could not take, and Miriam had felt the noose of dread tightening around her throat, waiting for the day they came to her gate. It was that night, while her daughter slept, that the dogs began to bark wild, their hackles sharp in the firelight, and Miriam's heart lurched as she gripped the shotgun and stepped onto the porch. Rain hadn't fallen in weeks, but the air smelled of iron, sharp as blood, and in the dark shape by her corral she saw him, a man, tall, broad-shouldered, his hair long and tied, scars scoring his face, his chest heaving as though he'd ridden through fire itself. She raised the gun, her voice shaking as she shouted, but when he lifted his face to hers, the words died in her throat. His eyes were the same, sharp, flint dark, unyielding, the eyes of the boy who had pulled her from the river 3 decades past. She staggered back against the doorframe, breath leaving her chest as if the flood had taken her again, because she knew him, knew the way he looked at her like he had then, not as prey, not as stranger, but as one whose life had once been claimed in his hands. He said no word at first, only studied her, and then in a voice deep as stone he spoke. "You remember." Her shotgun shook in her grip, tears burning her eyes as memories drowned her. The water, the hand pressed to her chest, the vow in his silence. "You," she whispered, her throat dry. He stepped closer, moving with the strength of a man who had carried battles on his shoulders, and though her fear screamed, another voice rose louder, the voice of a girl who had been given back her breath. "Why now?" she managed, her body trembling. His gaze flicked toward the horizon, where smoke curled faint against the stars. "Raiders," he said, the word guttural, final, and Miriam felt her stomach twist because she knew. He hadn't come for her, not for thanks, not for debt. He had come because war was at her door. Her daughter stirred inside, calling softly for her mother, and Miriam's heart clenched as the warrior's eyes shifted past her shoulder, his face hardening not with anger, but with something deeper. "I swore once to save you," he said, his voice low, steady. "Now I save what is yours." The next dawn broke jagged with hoofbeats, the kind that carried dust and menace, and Miriam knew before she even reached the window that the raiders had found her land. Their voices carried on the wind, jeering, cruel, a pack of wolves laughing at the scent of blood, and her daughter clutched at her arm, fear wide in her eyes. Miriam pushed her toward the cellar, but before panic could swallow her, the door burst open and the warrior stood there, rifle already in hand, his face unreadable, carved with the calm of a man who had seen too many mornings like this. "Stay low," he ordered, his words clipped but steady, and she obeyed, though every nerve screamed to shield her child with her own body. Through the slats of the shutter, she watched him walk straight into the yard. No hesitation, no tremor, as the raiders reined up at the fence. Their horses snorting, their pistols loose in their hands. Their leader, a brute with a scar splitting his lip, spat into the dirt and barked, "Old woman's farm, we'll take it. Out of the way, redskin." But the warrior didn't move. He planted himself before the corral, broad as the barn itself, and leveled his rifle without a word. The silence stretched, dangerous, and Miriam's heart pounded until she thought her ribs would crack. Then the scar-lipped man laughed, sharp and ugly, and signaled with 2 fingers. 3 guns came up. The first shot cracked like thunder, wood splintering inches from Miriam's face where she crouched inside, and she screamed. But outside, the warrior had already fired. His bullet struck true, dropping the nearest raider clean out of the saddle. Horses reared, men shouted, the yard erupted in chaos. But the warrior didn't flinch. He chambered another round, his motions smooth as riverstone turning under current, and another man fell before Miriam even drew a breath. The scar-lipped leader roared, spurring his horse forward, firing wild, and the warrior dropped to one knee, rifle braced, his shot tearing the man's hat clean away and carving a furrow across his cheek. Blood sprayed, the leader cursed, and in that second of hesitation Miriam saw her chance. She shoved her daughter into the cellar, slammed the trapdoor shut, and burst into the yard with her old shotgun clutched tight. The raiders wheeled, their fury turning on her, but before they could fire, the warrior's arm swept out, shoving her behind him with a force that rattled her bones. His voice cracked like steel. "Stay back." His eyes burned. Not with anger, but with the same fierce fire she remembered from the river. The same vow pressed into her chest all those years ago. He was not just fighting raiders. He was standing between her blood and the grave again. She gripped the shotgun tight, breath ragged, and whispered through the chaos, "Why do you do this for me?" He didn't turn, didn't blink, only fired once more into the dust and answered with a voice like stone breaking, because your life is mine." The yard stank of blood and gunpowder when the last raider fled, his horse tearing a wild line into the hills, leaving bodies twisted in the dust. Miriam stood frozen in the doorway, the shotgun slack in her hands, her ears still ringing with shots, her chest heaving as smoke curled from the warrior's rifle. He lowered it only after silence settled, slow and heavy, like a weight pressing down on the land. Her daughter climbed from the cellar, her face pale, her hair tangled, staring at the fallen men with wide eyes that shimmered with shock. Miriam pulled her close, trembling, whispering thanks to God. But when she looked at the warrior, she knew the truth. It wasn't prayer that had saved them. It was him. He stood tall, calm as stone, wiping blood from his arm where a bullet had grazed him, his expression unreadable. His eyes cutting through the wreckage as though none of it surprised him. Miriam felt the memory of the river surge back, the boy's arms lifting her from drowning, his hand pressed to her chest, his vow written in silence. 30 years had passed, and still he was there, a shadow in her life that would not let her forget she owed breath itself to him. She watched her daughter, young, unscarred, with years ahead, and a sick heaviness twisted in her stomach. A life had been saved once. A life had been saved again. What debt could possibly answer that? When the sheriff and his men finally arrived, too late, too slow, they praised her for holding out, never seeing the truth. The warrior said nothing, only stood aside as though he didn't exist. But Miriam saw him, every scar, every ounce of strength, every line carved by battles she could never imagine. That night, after her daughter slept, Miriam sat at the table, staring at her hands. They trembled, not from fear, but from the knowledge that she carried a debt heavier than the grave. When the warrior stepped in, silent as shadow, she met his gaze and forced words through her dry throat. "You saved me once as a child. Now you've saved my daughter and me both. I cannot carry this weight forever." His eyes narrowed, his face cut from stone. "I asked for nothing." But she shook her head, tears burning her eyes. "Debts unpaid rot the soul. If my life is yours, then take what is mine. Take my daughter's hand. Let the debt end." The words tasted like ashes even as she spoke them, her heart twisting in guilt and love, but she pushed them out because she believed there was no other way. The warrior's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward the closed door of her daughter's room, his silence heavy as iron. He turned back to Miriam, his voice low, rough as gravel. "A life saved is not a chain. Don't bind her for what belongs to you." But she pressed her palms to her face, sobbing into the dark, whispering, "I have no other gift left." And for the first time, his eyes softened, not with pity but with something heavier, a sorrow that lived deep in his marrow. He stepped closer, bent enough for her to see the scar at his temple, the one he had carried since the river, and spoke like a vow sharpened to a blade. "What I saved, I keep safe. That is all." Her daughter overheard it before Miriam could decide if she would speak. Her words carried through the thin cabin walls, carried with all the weight of desperation, and when morning came, the girl's face was pale and set like carved oak. She stepped into the kitchen where Miriam tried to busy her hands with bread that would not rise, and her voice, sharp but trembling, cut the silence. "You offered me." Miriam froze, the knife slipping from her grip, her chest collapsing under the truth. She turned, words fumbling, but her daughter's eyes, so young, so alive, so unwilling, burned into her like the river's cold bite. "Mama," she whispered, voice cracking, "you gave me away like coin." Miriam's throat locked as tears filled her eyes, her hands trembling. "I did it to save you, to repay what we owe. Twice he stood between us and death." I can't live with the weight of that debt." Her daughter shook her head, her hair spilling wild across her face, her lips pressed tight until they bled. "I'm not a debt. I'm not yours to trade." The warrior stepped in then, silent as dawn, his eyes narrowing at the sharp edge of voices. He carried his scars like armor, but in that moment his face held something gentler, sorrow heavy as stone. The girl turned on him, fire rising where tears had been. "Did you know?" she demanded. "Did you come for me?" His jaw tightened, his silence stretching like a blade across the room, and then he shook his head once. "I came because danger hunts you. I never asked for her gift." Miriam sagged, burying her face in her hands, but her daughter stepped forward, anger burning brighter than fear. "Then tell her," she begged, her voice breaking. "Tell her I'm not a chain for her guilt." The warrior's gaze shifted to Miriam, sharp and steady, and he spoke in a voice low as thunder. "You saved me, too." Miriam's head lifted, tears streaking her cheeks, confusion wrinkling her brow. "No," she whispered, shaking. "It was you who pulled me from the river, you who stood against the raiders. I've given nothing back." But his eyes held hers, fierce and unyielding. "You remembered me. Through all the years, through your loss, through your fear, you carried me. A boy alone becomes a ghost. But you held me alive in your memory. That was my salvation." Miriam's breath shuddered, her chest aching with the weight of his words, but her daughter stepped between them, her voice trembling with the rawness of truth. "Then let it end here. No vows, no chains, just choice." She turned to her mother, her hand soft against Miriam's cheek. "You don't owe him with me. You raised me. You gave me love. That was your debt paid." Miriam sobbed, her arms wrapping around her child, clinging like she might never let go, while the warrior stood apart, his shadow long across the cabin floor. For a moment the air was still, only the sound of their breathing, the weight of things unspoken pressing the walls inward. Then the warrior's voice broke the silence, rough and steady. "Raiders will come again. When they do, decide not with fear, but with fire. That is the only gift worth giving." And he turned, stepping out into the yard, his figure swallowed by the rising sun, leaving mother and daughter with the truth raw and burning in their chests. The second raid came faster than Miriam feared, the smoke rising over the ridge before the week had turned, hooves drumming the earth like war drums that rattled the dishes on her shelves. She froze at the window, her daughter at her side, both of them watching as riders spilled across the valley. More this time, twice the number, their laughter carrying sharp across the wind. Her stomach hollowed, her hands shaking. But before despair could take her, the cabin door opened, and the warrior strode in, his rifle already loaded, his face a wall of stone. He had been waiting. He set no words to comfort, no lies to soften the fear. Instead, he looked straight at Miriam, and then at her daughter, his voice steady and hard. "This time, you stand with me." Her daughter's eyes widened, fear warring with resolve. But before Miriam could shield her, the warrior placed a blade in the girl's hands, small but sharp, and met her gaze with a fire that left no room for doubt. "Choice," he said, echoing her own plea days before. "You carry no debt. You carry fire." The girl's hand trembled, but she nodded, her jaw tight. Miriam wanted to cry out, to pull her child into the cellar and bar the door, but the warrior's eyes cut through her, reminding her of what he had said, that fear was no gift, that fire was the only thing worth giving. The riders thundered into the yard, torches raised, guns gleaming, their leader's scarred lips split wide with hate. He barked for them to come out, to lay down, but the warrior stepped from the porch before the words finished, rifle lifted smooth. His shot cracked, dropping the first man before he'd even swung his torch. Chaos ripped loose. Horses screamed, raiders roared, and the yard exploded in smoke and lead. Miriam dragged her daughter to the wall, firing her old shotgun into the dust, the recoil bruising her shoulder but pride scorching her veins as her child did not cower. She pressed the blade tight, ready, eyes locked on the door. Bullets tore through boards, splinters biting their faces, but the warrior moved through the storm like a shadow born of battle, his shots precise, his body unyielding. When a raider broke through the side, screaming, Miriam's daughter lunged with the knife, catching him across the arm, drawing blood that sent him reeling. Her scream was raw, but her stance held, and Miriam felt something break in her chest. Not fear, but fierce, unstoppable pride. The warrior's voice tore through the gunfire. "Hold!" His command snapped like thunder, and Miriam felt strength surge in her veins. She fired again, reloaded with shaking hands, and fired once more until the yard reeked of smoke and death. Men fell, horses fled, and the scar-lipped leader cursed, retreating, his voice cutting the night. "This isn't done, woman. We'll come again." Then the valley fell silent, but for the groans of the dying, the hiss of smoke curling off the fence, the rasp of their breathing. Miriam staggered out into the yard, the gun slack in her hands, her daughter at her side streaked with dirt and blood, but standing, unbroken. The warrior lowered his rifle, his eyes meeting theirs, and for the first time, Miriam saw something shift in him, something almost like pride. He nodded once, sharp, and said only, "Now the fire is yours." The silence after the raid was heavier than the fight itself. Bodies cooling in the yard, the smell of gunpowder and sweat still clinging to the air like a curse. Miriam stood with her daughter, arms trembling, her shotgun empty, her eyes fixed on the warrior as he walked the perimeter, checking for movement, making sure no wounded raider still breathed. Every step he took was steady, deliberate, his face unreadable, but Miriam knew what he was doing, measuring how long they had before the next storm. Her daughter leaned against her, chest heaving, streaks of blood and dirt across her cheeks, and Miriam kissed her hair with a sob of pride and guilt tangled together. She had wanted to repay a debt with her daughter's hand, but the child had already given something greater, her courage, her blade, her fire. The warrior stopped at the edge of the corral, his rifle slung, his eyes on the horizon where the hills dipped dark under the rising sun. "They'll gather more," he said, his voice low, ragged with certainty. "This is not done." Miriam's stomach knotted, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Then we'll be ready." He shook his head, his braid swaying with the movement, his eyes dark with something heavier than fear. "You were never meant to carry this war. I should not have brought it here." Miriam stepped closer, her voice breaking but strong. "You didn't bring it. They did. You saved us, twice, and I tried to pay you with chains." His face flickered. Pain, maybe anger, but mostly something softer, something he tried to bury. He turned from her, staring again at the horizon, his shoulders stiff. "A debt of life cannot be given in flesh. It must be kept in fire. That is why I stayed." Miriam felt tears burn her throat, the memory of the river searing back, the boy's hand pressed to her chest, the vow written in silence. He had carried that oath all these years, through scars and loss, and now stood here still bound by it. Her daughter stepped forward then, her small voice cutting the heavy air. "You don't owe us any more," she said, trembling but steady. "We fight beside you now." The warrior turned, his eyes locking on the girl, and for the first time a crack showed in his armor. Something like pride, something like sorrow. "You are not mine to make warriors," he said. But his voice shook as though part of him believed she already was. Miriam's fatherly instinct warred with the truth gnawing inside her. This battle would not end until blood was spilled, hers or his. She could not ask her daughter to carry it, and she could not let the warrior bear it alone. That night, when the fire burned low and the prairie wind moaned through the broken fence, Miriam sat across from him at the table, her hands folded tight. "If there is another fight," she whispered, "I will stand in the middle. Let the debt be mine alone." He lifted his eyes to her, steady as stone, and for a long moment said nothing. Then he leaned forward, his scar catching the lamplight, his voice like gravel ground under water. "Debts don't die with one. They burn through generations. But maybe this time, we end it with fire." The dawn broke not with birdsong, but with thunder of hooves, a sound too heavy, too many, rolling over the ridge like the sky itself had unleashed war. Miriam stood in the yard, her shotgun reloaded, her daughter at her side clutching the same knife now stained with a raider's blood. The warrior stood ahead of them both, broad-shouldered, rifle ready, his eyes narrowed to the line of dust and figures cresting the hills. Dozens this time, 20 at least, riding hard, torches raised, their shouts carrying across the prairie like the cries of wolves. Miriam's blood turned to ice, but there was no cellar deep enough, no fence high enough. This was where they would stand. The warrior's voice cut sharp. "Inside, bar the door." But Miriam shook her head, gripping her gun until her knuckles whitened. "I'll not cower again. If the end comes, I meet it here." Her daughter echoed her, voice fierce though thin. "Me too." For a moment the warrior's face shifted, torn between fury and something almost like pride, and then he nodded once, sharp. "Then we fight." The raiders swarmed into the yard, their leader, the scar-lipped brute whose cheek still bore the warrior's mark, bellowing above the chaos. "Burn it! Leave nothing!" Gunfire split the air. Miriam fired first, her shot tearing through a rider's chest, the recoil slamming her shoulder but the rush of it igniting something savage inside. The warrior's rifle cracked again and again, each shot precise, each raider toppled like a felled tree, but still they came, pouring over the fences, filling the yard with steel and fire. Horses screamed, flames licked the corral, bullets tore through wood. Miriam dragged her daughter behind the trough, firing again, her ears ringing with every blast, her lungs burning with smoke. A raider lunged at them, blade flashing, and before Miriam could raise her gun, her daughter struck. Knife burying deep in his thigh, his howl split by the warrior's bullet that dropped him cold. "Stay low," the warrior roared, his voice raw, but Miriam saw the truth. They were surrounded, pinned against their own walls, the numbers too many. Still he fought like a man born of storms, his body a wall between them and the grave, his rifle never faltering, his jaw clenched tight against pain when a bullet grazed his arm. Miriam felt her chest crack with terror and awe all at once. This was the boy from the river, now a man, still carrying her life in his hands. The raiders pressed harder, torches striking the barn. Flames leaping high, smoke choking the air. Miriam fired blind through it, coughing, her daughter clutching her side, until suddenly the scar-lipped leader burst through the haze on horseback, pistol aimed at the warrior's chest. Time slowed. Miriam screamed, the warrior swung, but the shot came first, slamming him back into the mud. The world blurred, noise vanishing into a hollow roar in Miriam's ears as she dropped her gun and crawled toward him, the daughter's screams sharp behind her. His chest heaved shallow, blood pooling, his eyes still fixed on her with that same vow they had shared 30 years ago. "Get up," she begged, shaking him, tears streaking her face as bullets ripped past. His lips parted, breath weak, but his voice, steady even as blood choked it, rasped the words that cut her marrow. Not yet. The world shrank to mud and fire, the warrior's blood soaking into the earth as Miriam knelt over him, her trembling hands pressing against the wound, her ears deaf to everything but his rasping breath. The raiders circled, their leader grinning through the smoke, scar split wider with every sneer. He reined in his horse, pistol raised, savoring the sight like a cat with a cornered bird. "There's your savior," he spat, his voice raw with triumph. "Nothing but a broken dog." Miriam's heart clenched, terror surging, but under it something harder rose. Rage, deep and fierce, 30 years of borrowed life burning to a point. She shoved herself to her feet, shotgun raised and fired. The blast missed his chest but tore through his arm, ripping the pistol from his hand. He howled, reeling in the saddle, and the yard erupted again. Raiders firing, shouting, the air thick with lead and smoke. Miriam's daughter darted from cover, blade flashing, her small figure weaving through the chaos like fire-made flesh. She slashed at a rider's leg, dragging him from his horse, her scream sharp enough to split the air. "Mama!" she cried, and Miriam turned just in time to see another raider charging her child, axe raised. Her body moved before thought. She fired, the shot blasting him back into the dirt, her hand steady, her chest burning with something wild and unyielding. Behind her the warrior stirred, his hand clawed into the mud, his chest heaving, and with a guttural roar he dragged himself upright, blood pouring but eyes blazing. He snatched his rifle from the ground, braced it against his knee, and fired into the chaos, each shot fueled by something deeper than flesh, something older than pain. Raiders toppled one after another, their screams swallowed by the storm. The scar-lipped leader dismounted, staggering toward him, fury blazing, a knife gleaming in his good hand. "You should have stayed in the river," he snarled, lunging. The warrior rose to meet him, staggering, blood streaking his chest, but his grip on the blade was iron. The two men collided in the mud, steel clashing, fists cracking, each blow a thunderclap against the storm. Miriam's daughter screamed, but Miriam held her back, her eyes locked on the battle because she knew. This was the ending, the debt, the vow. The leader slashed the warrior's arm, blood spraying, but the warrior slammed his fist into the man's scarred face, dragging him down into the mud. They rolled, snarling, striking, until the knife rose high, gleaming with firelight. Miriam screamed his name, though she had never spoken it before, and the warrior's hand shot up, catching the raider's wrist, twisting with a force that tore bone from socket. The knife clattered into the mud, and with a final roar the warrior drove it into the leader's chest, deep, final. The man's scream died in his throat, his eyes wide with shock, and then he collapsed into silence. The yard went still. The raiders who still lived fled, their hooves scattering into the hills, leaving only fire, smoke, and the sound of the warrior gasping in the mud, his chest rising and falling like a storm breaking apart. Miriam ran to him, cradling his head in her lap, her tears washing streaks into the dirt on his face. He opened his eyes, faint but burning, and whispered, "Now. The debt is done." The storm broke into silence, as if the earth itself had exhaled, smoke trailing from the barn, the yard littered with bodies, rain turning the dust to dark rivers that ran red with blood. Miriam cradled the warrior's head in her lap, her tears streaking his face, her voice raw as she begged him to hold on. Her daughter knelt beside her, clutching his hand, her small fingers tight around his scarred knuckles. His breath was shallow, chest rising like a bellows losing fire, but his eyes opened, and for a heartbeat they burned with the same flint-dark light she had seen when he dragged her from the river as a child. "You saved me again," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved all of us." His lips curved, faint, cracked, as if the words carried no weight to him, only truth. "I kept my vow." His voice was gravel, heavy with blood, but his hand tightened on hers, and she felt the strength that still lived in him. He coughed, the sound harsh, but then his gaze shifted to her daughter, steady and piercing even through the haze of pain. "You carry. Fire now," he rasped. "Not debt, not chains. Fire." The girl nodded, tears streaking her cheeks, her jaw set with the steel of everything she had endured. Miriam pressed her forehead to his, sobbing, but he whispered again, softer, like wind against water. "Take me, to the river." At dawn they carried him there, the three of them walking slowly, the prairie hushed as if the land itself watched. The river rushed below, swollen with rain, its current fierce but alive, the same waters that had almost taken Miriam's breath 30 years before. She helped him down to the bank, her arms steady though her legs trembled, and laid him against the stones. The warrior gazed at the water, eyes shining with memory, and a faint smile ghosted his lips. "Here," he whispered, "where it began." Miriam knelt beside him, her heart breaking, her fingers tangled in his, and her daughter stood close, her knife at her side, her chin lifted, strong though her eyes spilled grief. "Don't leave," Miriam begged, her voice torn. "I cannot lose you now." He turned his head, his cheek brushing hers, his breath warm though faint. "No one is lost, who is remembered." His words slid into her bones like truth hammered in iron, and with a final breath, his chest stilled, his hand softening in hers. The river kept moving, carrying on as if to remind them that life flowed no matter who it took. Miriam pressed her face to his, her tears falling into the current, whispering thanks, love, sorrow all at once. Her daughter knelt on the other side, her hand on Miriam's shoulder, her voice steady though it cracked. "Mama," she whispered, "we carry him now." And Miriam knew it was true. The boy who had saved her, the man who had saved them both, had not been lost to mud and blood. He had been woven into them, into her daughter, into the fire they now carried forward. She rose slowly, her hand still clutching his until the current lapped it away, and together mother and daughter turned from the river, walking into the light of a broken dawn. Behind them the waters roared, and if one listened close enough, it sounded like a vow, still alive, still kept.